Hello, and welcome back to Durkee Community Church. Today is May 31st, 2020. It's hard to believe that it's nearly June already, but it most definitely is. It was plum toasty today. I hope that you all are doing well. In last week's message, I talked about blessings and how Jesus' empty tomb was a symbol of his resurrection as an ascension to heaven. I know that in these crazy times that we're living in, I'm thankful that he has indeed been resurrected. But before God reached out and blessed him, and through him all of us, you and me, there was humility. Jesus was the humblest of humble men. I've spoken before about how Jesus could have had it made here on earth. He was, after all, the Son of God. He could have had angels waiting on him hand and foot. He could have had palaces, slaves, the best things to eat, and the finest clothes to wear. But instead, he chose to come to earth in the flesh of mortal man, and he came to earth to be the shepherd for all of us poor misguided sinners. Traditionally, in biblical times, the shepherd was considered the lowliest of the low. The youngest son of the family was pretty much always chosen to go out and tend the sheep. I'm not sure if that was because the youngest son was considered to be expendable if predators came along to attack the flock or what, but I would suppose that such a possibility probably did exist. I mean, after all, it was easy to get new kids, but not necessarily easy to get new sheep. And also, there were no firearms available back then, so if the guy out tending the sheep had a stick and maybe a sling and a bag full of rocks, he was doing pretty good. And that would be all that he had available to protect the sheep from lions and bears and whatever other predators were around. Not only that, but the shepherd had to be there in good and bad weather, heat, cold, rain, whatever. There were no trailers or campers, maybe not even a tent, I don't know, for him to sleep in. Sounds like the kind of life pretty much nobody would want, doesn't it? So anyone who has read any of the Bible at all, and maybe even those who haven't but who know a little about the lineage of Jesus, know the name David. David, it turns out, was the one who God chose to be the king of Israel after Saul. He was the youngest of 8 kids, but when Samuel showed up to find a new king for Israel, his father Jesse brought each of his other sons and showed them to Samuel before he even mentioned David. It was sort of like, as I said, David was expendable and out of sight, out of mind. I mean, he was a shepherd. Jesse probably figured that there was no way that God was going to pick such a lowly being to be a king. So let's go to the 16th chapter of Samuel's first book in the Old Testament and learn a little bit more about this young man. And I will, as usual, be reading from the New King James Version of the Bible, and I would like to begin in verse 4 of that chapter. Sorry this is taking so long. So Samuel did what the Lord said and went to Bethlehem. And the elders of the town trembled at his coming and said, "Do you come peaceably?" And he said, "Peaceably, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Sanctify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice." Then he consecrated Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice. So it was, when they came, that he looked at Eliab and said, "Surely the Lord's anointed is before him." But the Lord said to Samuel, "Do not look at his appearance or at his physical stature, because I have refused him. For the Lord does not see as a man sees. For a man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So Jesse called Abinadab and made him pass before Samuel. And he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Then Jesse made Shammah pass by, and he said, "Neither has the Lord chosen this one." Thus Jesse made 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. And Samuel said to Jesse, "The Lord has not chosen these." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Are all the young men here?" Then he said, "There remains yet the youngest, and there he is keeping the sheep." And Samuel said to Jesse, "Send and bring him, for we will not sit down till he comes here." So he sent and brought him in. Now he was ruddy, with bright eyes, and good looking. And the Lord said, "Arise, anoint him, for this is the one." Then Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers, and the Spirit of the Lord came upon David from that day forward. So Samuel arose and went to Ramah. Now, anybody who's been around sheep at all knows that they're not really very smart. My personal feeling about them is that a sheep goes through life looking for a reason to die and quite often finding it. But that's just one person's opinion. In other words, sheep aren't especially tough, and they're not generally smart enough to get out of the way when something bad comes along, like a coyote or another predator. Sometimes I think that the phrase fat, dumb, and happy was coined to describe sheep. That having been said, aren't most people a lot like sheep? I don't mean that most people are dumb. What I mean when I say that people are like sheep is that they get into trouble easily. Maybe not so much law trouble as we think of the law, although that does happen too. Instead, I'm thinking more along the lines of spiritual trouble. I believe that this is because most people don't like being told what to do. They want to go their own way and follow the path that they want to follow, even if it leads to something that, if they stop to think about it, wouldn't be their first choice as an activity. My wife Cheryl and her mom, who I think everybody around Durkee knows as either Mima or Grandma Jean, have a little bunch of sheep. They usually pen them up at night in hopes of keeping coyotes from eating any of them. Then they turn them out to graze during the day. Sometimes coyotes get into them during the day while they're out grazing, most often first thing in the morning as opposed to later in the day. So consequently, I sometimes find myself on what I call coyote overwatch. What that means is that I get there before Cheryl turns the sheep out and sit by the fence with a rifle and watch for coyotes to get into the sheep when they go out to pasture in the morning. And I've managed to snipe a few that way over the years. When the sheep first get let out of the night pen, the first place that they head is the far side of the pasture. And I do mean the far side. The only thing stopping them from going further is a woven wire fence. Not only do they go to the far side of the field, but they pretty much follow the same trail every day, and they go pretty much in single file. They are followers. Following is another trait that people share with sheep. Somebody will come up with something that seems like a good idea, or if it's not really all that good an idea, it fills a need in the person hearing it. And the next thing you know, you've got something like Jonestown going on because the sheep were led astray. Jesus kind of talks about that sort of thing in John chapter 10. He calls himself the Good Shepherd because he cares about the sheep and he leads them to the best pasture, then brings them back again. At the same time, he talks about how a hired hand doesn't care about the sheep, and because he doesn't, the sheep don't have a very good life if they're tended by that hired hand. And also in that 10th chapter of the book of John, Jesus talks a lot about the attributes of a shepherd who cares about his flock. And at the same time, he talks a lot about the one who doesn't care about the sheep. I would like to read some passages from this chapter, so let's turn to John chapter 10, and let's begin our reading with verse 1. Most assuredly, I say to you, he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he who enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he brings out his own sheep, he goes before them, and the sheep follow him, but they know his voice. Yet they will by no means follow a stranger, but will flee from him, for they do not know the voice of strangers. Now, Jesus just told us that the flock will flee from strangers because they don't know the voices of the strangers. Unfortunately, many of the flock do just the opposite. They run to the strangers, and I think that they do that because the strangers offer what seems like a better deal. That deal might be power or money, whatever the heart may desire. But once you take the deal, then things go downhill in a hurry. Even Jesus heard the siren song of the tempter, but he didn't give in to it. Instead, he told the devil to, for all intents and purposes, take a hike. So let's now turn to Matthew chapter 4. And I would like to begin in verse 1 of that chapter. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And when he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, afterward he was hungry. Now when the tempter came to him, he said, If you are the Son of God, command that these stones become bread. But he answered and said, It is written, Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God. Then the devil took him up into the holy city, set him on the pinnacle of the temple, and said to him, If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He shall give his angels charge over you, and in their hands they shall bear you up, lest you dash your foot against a stone. Jesus said to him, It is written again, You shall not tempt the Lord your God. Again the devil took him up on an exceedingly high mountain, and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. And he said to him, All these things I will give you if you will fall down and worship me. Then Jesus said to him, Away with you, Satan, for it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, in him only you shall serve. Then the devil left him, and behold, angels came and ministered to him. Now I realize that not all of us are as tough as Jesus was when it comes to listening to the wrong voices. Some things that you hear just sound so good that you don't realize until it's too late just what it is that you're giving up or getting into. It's often easier to follow along with the crowd than it is to think for yourself. When you become a part of the crowd, you may suddenly find that you're lost and don't know the way back to where you were before. And why might that be? It's because you're just not listening to the voice of the shepherd anymore, and that's what got you in trouble. And suddenly, you find that the ones who led you astray are nowhere to be seen. So let's go back now to the 10th chapter of John and go to verse 7 of that chapter. And beginning in verse 7 of John chapter 10. Then Jesus said to them again, Most assuredly I say to you, I am the door of the sheep. All who ever came before me are thieves and robbers, but the sheep did not hear them. I am the door. If anyone enters by me, he will be saved, and will go in and out and find pasture. The thief does not come except to steal and to kill and to destroy. I have come that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep, but a hireling, he who is not the shepherd, one who does not own the sheep, sees the wolf coming and leaves the sheep and flees, and the wolf catches the sheep and scatters them. The hireling flees because he is a hireling and does not care about the sheep. I am the good shepherd, and I know my sheep, and am known by my own. As the Father knows me, even so I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. And other sheep I have, which are not of this fold. Them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd. Jesus came, to quote him, that they may have life, and that they may have it more abundantly. He's not really talking about making anyone rich or famous or whatever it is that you might think of as living an abundant life, although these things could possibly happen. You just never know. Instead, what I think that this passage means is that you'll have a life of spiritual freedom even though you may be incarcerated. By following Him, you can leave your old life, your old body as it were, behind and step into a new body and a new life. Now, the Apostle Paul talked about the new man in several of his letters to the churches that he started. So let's read part of one of those letters in the 3rd chapter of the book of Colossians, and I would like to start in verse 12 of that chapter. Therefore, as the elect of God, holy and beloved, put on tender mercies, kindness, humility, meekness, long-suffering, bearing with one another, and forgiving one another, if anyone has a complaint against another. Even as Christ forgave you, so you also must do. But of all these things put on love, which is the bond of perfection. And let the peace of God rule in your hearts, to which also you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with grace in your hearts to the Lord. And whatever you do in word or deed, do all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through Him. So, you're a new man in Christ, or a woman as the case may be. You're praying, you're attending church and fellowshipping with other believers, you're doing your level best to become more like God every day. Sure, you slip sometimes, you stumble around, and sometimes you're even crawling on your knees. In other words, you're human. And speaking of human, you'll remember that we started this message off with King David before he had any idea that he might become a king. He was also, in the words of the Apostle Paul, a man after God's own heart. But what does that mean to you and me? I think that it means, more than anything, that David, even though he did some things wrong, through it all had faith and trust in God. Now that we've come back full circle to David, I would like to look at one final passage of Scripture. This is one that is attributed to David, and one that should be in the back of everyone's mind each minute of the day. That passage is a psalm, Psalm 23. Please turn there now. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Wow. Talk about blessings. There's a whole list of blessings there, isn't there? But there's also an implied commitment on your part, if you think about it, when David writes that the Lord is my shepherd. He's saying that the Lord, in the form of God and Jesus Christ, is the one who takes care of you, the one who guides you, and the one who protects you, all of which is the definition of the word shepherd that we've been working on since we started this evening. If you can say that, then you're well on your way to living that abundant life that Jesus told you about in the 10th chapter of John that we read earlier. But what else is the shepherd going to do for you? That list goes on, doesn't it? First off, there's provision. When David says, I shall not want, he's not saying that he's going to be rich and famous. Instead, I believe that he's saying that he will live that abundant life that I already mentioned. God will provide what he needs and will guide him to a place of rest and replenish his strength. And as we read down, we also see that God will protect him from enemies and will feed him, bless him, and bring him into the house that Jesus promises later on in the Bible when he says in John chapter 14 that in my Father's house are many mansions. Is the Lord your shepherd? I sure do hope so. Once again, thank you for being with us this evening, and I do hope that you have a blessed week.